Oli here, and this is my review of Castrovalva, the first story of the 19th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Peter Davison in his first regular appearance as the Fifth Doctor. Castrovalva is the 117th story overall, is 4 parts long, and is written by Christopher H. Bidmead. And Castrovalva is the first review under the new name for this channel, the Oli-Versal Experience. Yay! I thought it would be inappropriate for a rebrand, and making the first review for a new era of Doctor Who, the Peter Davison era. And Castrovalva also brings the Master Trilogy to an end, where the newly regenerated Doctor finally defeats the Master once and for all, until he returns at the end of season 19. So previously, we saw the Fourth Doctor regenerate after falling from the Pharos Project telescope, thanks to the Master, and he regenerates whilst Nessa and his new companions, Nessa, Teagan, not necessarily new companion Adric, witnesses the regeneration. So the plot of Castrovalva is as follows. The Doctor defeats the Master's plans to hold the universe to ransom, but at a high cost to himself, plummeting from the Pharos Project radio telescope. The Doctor regenerates. The time travelers escape the Master's clutches, but the Doctor's regeneration is failing, and Adric goes missing in the depths of the Tardis. Only Nessa and Teagan can save the day, steering the time ship towards the city of Castrovalva, renowned for its healing powers. But evil lurks at the heart of this rural paradise. So that is the plot of Castrovalva. Castrovalva? Mwah. I absolutely love Castrovalva. It doesn't get as much love as in comparison to the rest of Classic Who, or even the Peter Davison era. I would actually say that Castrovalva is my favorite Peter Davison story, and one of the best post-generation stories in Classic Who. And I think the reason why I love it so much, I think it's because I think the characterization it works well. I think the Fifth Doctor's introduction is just absolutely superb, and I think this is definitely one of Peter Davison's best performances as the Fifth Doctor. And considering the fact this is actually the last story he filmed in this season, because other stories when he needed to build the confidence, and I think he definitely learned from his mistakes and his setbacks, and definitely applied them here, and he pretty much became an amazing Doctor, and a very confident Doctor, must I add. And I definitely think that even though the Peter Davison era isn't necessarily a strong era in comparison to other eras in Doctor Who, even though it does have its fair share of friends who I've seen on social media and stuff like that, but Peter Davison is actually one of my favorite Doctors, and he's very much like the 10th Doctor, and even it is pretty ironic because the 5th Peter Davison is David Tennant's father-in-law, and David Tennant pretty much based his performance on the 5th Doctor, so it makes sense. So I thought the production of Castrovalva was very good. I really like the set of Castrovalva itself. It looked very much like an alien Greek city, minus the togas and shit, but it looked very interesting and very majestic. Like an alien, and even the forest outside the city itself looked very alien. It looked quite old, but it had its appeal. And oddly enough, I think the Zero Room looks really nice, and I like the concept of it. It was basically this whole room where there's no interference, and it pretty much allowed the Doctor to heal from his regeneration, because he did fall from from an insane height, and it caused him to regenerate. I also like the costume of the Castrovalva natives, and Castrovalva is the first Doctor Who story not to air on Saturday nights, and I think the rest of the Peter Davison era doesn't actually air on Saturday nights. From season 19, Doctor Who aired twice a week on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and I think the following season aired on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and season 21 aired on Thursdays and Fridays, I believe. And they also aired twice a week, so the seasons won't run as long as 6 months or so. So it's pretty much seasons will probably be airing between January and March, as opposed to other seasons where it was probably starting in September or late August and end in, let's say, late February, early March or something. And I do feel as if Castrovalva is pretty evident that John Nathan Turner has pretty much fixed some of the issues that prevented season 18 from being a great season. Even though season 18 is a very fantastic season, but I think it does have some bits that hinder the season from being a great season, such as the humor, for instance. I know that John Nathan Turner set out to try and reduce a lot of the overtly comedic elements that was in the Graham Williams era, but he did sneak in. There was some like humorous elements, but obviously not too much. And it wasn't too, and it was quite serious as well. But the seriousness doesn't really. The seriousness kind of remains, but I think it's slight. But I think Castrovalva and alongside other stories in season 19 are somewhat light-hearted in comparison to the rest of season 18, which was quite dreary and moody. And season 19 is pretty much gives like a breath of a fresh breath of air, and with a new doctor, Peter Davison, who's taking over the role from Tom Baker, who's pretty much on the show for at least 7 years. Yes, but obviously John Nathan-Turner doesn't actually reach Graham Williams' level of humor. In addition, the theme of the story was actually explained, such as the topic of recursion, which is a real-life mathematical aspect, which I'll explain what it is later on, and the plot actually does explain what recursion is, and I think it was a good idea, because if you're introducing like highly advanced real-world stuff into like a family show where people would be like, huh? And the people, and they explain that people actually get in comparison to the Leisure Hive, which not necessarily explained, they had tachyonic, but they did a bit of a crap job of explaining what it is. The title sequence also does get a bit of an upgrade. Obviously, with Peter Davison replacing Tom Baker's face, and I think the placement of the face is slightly better than for Tom Baker's face, because for Peter Davison, as soon as the camera like zooms in on his face, Peter Davison like cracks a bit of a smile. But in comparison to the Fourth Doctor's title sequence in season 18, it's just Tom Baker's head just there with a very awkward look on his face, and just zooms in on the face. The script was quite well done, and the direction by Fiona Cumming was good as well. And I do think Castrovalva is a bit underrated as well. Also, highly enjoyed the plot of Castrovalva, obviously taking place at the events of Logopolis, so everyone was still pretty much trying to recuperate from what just happened in Logopolis, like the entire universe pretty much almost coming to an end, and obviously just the Master destroying other planets like Nissa's home planet Traken, and Nessa and Teagan dealing with the fact that the Master pretty much murdered her auntie Vanessa. But I think the Adric, Teagan, and Nessa pretty much just shrugged off the fact they witnessed the Doctor regenerate. But to be fair, I think the last 2-3 stories for them have been quite exhausting, so especially with Nessa finding out that her planet was pretty much destroyed by the Master, so they all pretty much just shrugged it off, and especially Adric as well. He's probably with the Doctor the longest compared to Nissa and Teagan, and the fact he's still pretty much trying to adjust to life in N space now that he's out of the E space. So yeah, they do kind of shrug it off, but I think given what they just went through in the past couple of stories, they just take it with stride and just go along with it. So Castrovalva was also named after the lithograph by graphic artist M.C. Escher, I don't know how to pronounce his name. And the city's design itself pretty much reflects the impossible nature which was evident in Escher's later works, and also recursion, the mathematical principles featured in the story, and the Doctor explained it, and it explained when the Doctor, Nissa, and Teagan were trying to get out of Castrovalva, but then they all ended up where they started from. So recursion is if you're trying to get, from what I understand, if you're trying to get to point A, you're trying to get from point B, but you're in point A, and you go to the path, but you end up going through path C when it takes you back to path A. So I think that's what I kind of understand in the story. I think that's how they actually explain what recursion is, and this was basically like, and this is a recursion trap that the Master / the Portreeve trapped them in, and because the Master wanted to get rid of the Doctor. And also Escher also used the theme of recursion in his works as well. I think Castrovalva itself does have some great moments. I think one of my favourite scenes in this story, which is one of the reasons why I love Castrovalva so much, is how Nessa and Teagan were able to steal the ambulance that arrived when they were getting arrested by the security guards and the police officers in the Faros telescope location, and obviously, unfortunately, they left Adric behind because he was still pretty much getting restrained by guards. So Nessa and Teagan were able to get the Doctor onto the ambulance, and they were able to drive a short distance to the TARDIS. And they also the music as well. When it was playing when they were driving the ambulance, it's even on the DVD menu. I think when I first put Castrovalva in the DVD menu, that's the first thing that came up, and I thought, this story should be quite interesting. And I also liked how the Master showed up at the last minute while Adric was still getting restrained by the police, and they were pretty much trying to like. Adric was struggling, and then the Master Tardis, which was still a column, just appeared and just materialized on top of Adric or something like that, and just shocked everyone to death. And it stunned Adric, but the Master was pretty much abducting Adric. Like, so the Master does actually like save Adric, but at the same time, the Master was using Adric for his own dirty deeds, which I'll explain towards in a bit. And I also liked the reveal of how the Portrait was the Master the whole time. And it was quite cool. And I also liked how the Doctor steps in the last minute to save Adric and defeat the Master. And then we also liked how the TARDIS team all reunited were trying to get out of Castrovalva, but then obviously the city was collapsing in on itself, and Adric was able to help them escape from Castrovalva. And I liked how the Castrovalva natives were able to like prevent the Master from escaping because his TARDIS wasn't able to escape from Castrovalva. It was quite cool scene. And also, that's also, I think Castrovalva collapsing in is also a bit of a throwback to the theme of season 18, which is entropy, which I explained that it was basically like disorderness and things getting older and things just dying. I also like the cliffhanger of part 1 when the Master who captured Adric, who was pretty much in restraints like that, as if he was Jesus Christ on his Hadron Reb, and then the Master was gloating to Nessa and Teagan that they're going to die because the TARDIS was being programmed to Event 1, which was basically the creation of the universe, and the Master was like, farewell my friends, farewell for good, and the Master's just laughing as the TARDIS is getting closer to the Event 1, but obviously I think the Doctor is able to step in at the last minute and saves them and gets the TARDIS out of Event 1. So I also like the part 3 cliffhanger when the Doctor, Nessa and Teagan discovered that Castrovalva was collapsing in on itself, and it showed like the different parts of Castrovalva, like the women just on the washing river or something like that, or just showed different parts of Castrovalva on screen. They were showed that as shards, as like there was one bit there, and it was representing what the Doctor, Nessa and Teagan was seeing. I thought that was quite cool. So on to the performances, I thought they were all quite good. Peter Davison debuts as the 5th Doctor, obviously, and I think he does a great job. And as I said before in the beginning, Castrovalva was basically the final story that was filmed for the 19th season, so the other stories can help Davison settle into the role very well. And I think he did a very good job. And I also liked, I think one of the most memorable parts of this story was how he was basically reenacting the first 4 regenerations, his first 4 incarnations, and I think I really enjoyed his first and second Doctor's impressions, and that he actually he really got like the impression of Charlton like on the nail. Like he was like doing the mannerisms like Jamie. Obviously, he was calling Adric Jamie, and funny enough, Adric does look like Jamie a little bit. And then I think that Davison actually did watch Doctor Who when he was growing up, and he admired Patrick Charlton, and obviously I think Patrick Charlton was definitely like the influential Doctor in Classic Who because he pretty much kind of made the show. But I thought it was a very good scene, so to speak, and I think at this point why the Doctor was pretty much reenacting pretending to be his first 4 incarnations, because he was still pretty much still very much disoriented from the regeneration, more so than usual, and he was starting acting weird, like not just the post usual alien post regeneration, but he was acting like very, very off because, as I said before, he did fall from a very great height, and it must have had at least some form of impact on the Doctor. And the 5th Doctor is pretty much undoing the scarf that he previously wore, and to try and find his way back to the console room. But I think I obviously do think the Doctor was starting to feel like himself, or a new version of himself, when he reached Castrovalva and was reunited with Nessa and Teagan. But obviously the Doctor forgot who he was, but he does recover quickly so he can get his companions out of Castrovalva. And I also like the end of the story when they go back to the TARDIS and the Doctor was like, I'm starting to feel like a new version of myself now. So I think that was, and I think you can definitely see that Peter Davison has definitely grown confidence in this role now, even though this is actually the last story that he filmed, because in other stories in this season he didn't look as confident. I think he even said he didn't like filming Photo Doomsday because he was making some mistakes, and I think there was a comment that Matthew Waterhouse actually made, which I actually discovered this yesterday, that during the production of Photo Doomsday, which was actually his first story, Waterhouse said to Davison that he'll never be as good as Tom Baker, and I thought that was, yes, it's a dick move. I think that also kind of affected Davison as well, but obviously I think this pretty much made him slightly better, made him more of a slightly better Doctor. Speaking of which, Matthew Waterhouse, I think he did a good job as well. Adric was separated from his fellow travelers for most of the story, as he was kidnapped by the Master, who was pretty much coerced into helping the Master create Castrovalva and caused the TARDIS to add the features, add Castrovalva into the TARDIS and cause the TARDIS to go to Event 1. But he was with the Doctor, who was still pretty much disoriented by the regeneration, and obviously he was called Jamie, the Brig, Teagan, Vicky, K9, and Romana, and obviously Adric had to remind the Doctor that Romana and K9 were still in E-Space, and it's because they left them there. But he doesn't appear for a good chunk of the story, and he does show up. Oh, but I think it was in part 3, he actually does show up to warn Nessa and Teagan about what was going on, and they shouldn't bother looking for him, but he does finally show up in part 4. And he was behind the tapestry all along, and he was still visibly weak from the effects of the Master's Hadron Web, and whilst they were on their way back to the TARDIS, you can actually hear Matthew Waterhouse just spewing his guts out. While the Doctor and Nessa was talking about the Tardis Landing, you can actually hear him just vomiting in the background, and obviously I think the script says that Adric needed to look quite disoriented because of this, and Matthew Waters actually succeeded in doing so because he had an all-night bender drinking Campari, and he was suffering from a hangover during the making of the story. So yeah, I think Matthew Waters definitely did achieve that effect, so to speak. Sarah Sutton also did a good job, and then Nessa and Teagan did the most of the literal heavy lifting in the story, as they were responsible for getting to Doctor into Castrovalva, who was inside the Zero cabinet, which was basically made from the doors from the Zero room. And when they tried to use the wheelchair to try and get the Doctor up to Castrovalva, especially up the mountain, but that never really happened, because even though the Doctor said that he would be levitating, so there wouldn't be as if that Nissa and Teagan were carrying nothing, but then I also kind of find it funny how they were using the Zero cabinet to carry some of the books of Castrovalva, and that was also quite funny. Speaking of books, I liked how Nissa was asking for books on telebiogenesis, which I found it funny because it was a delivery on the line and saying, "Do you have any books on telebiogenesis?" And people were like, "What?" And obviously Nissa did say that she knew very little about telebiogenesis, and I thought that was a very funny scene. I also found it quite funny how she ended up in the swamp. I was trying to recover the wheelchair that accidentally fell into the swamp, but then she had a face of disgust or something when she found something or stepped on something, but it was quite a funny scene. So obviously I think when the TARDIS landed in Castrovalva, Nessa changed her skirt that she wore on Traken to brown to brown trousers, which she does wear for the entire season. Yeah, I think the costuming department went on strike this season for a very odd reason. But I think, Sarah Sutton did do a very good job in the story. We also have Janet Fielding as Teagan. She was great, and this is Teagan's first proper adventure as a proper impromptu companion, because she didn't really have much of a choice to travel with the Doctor, because she accidentally ended up in the TARDIS in the last story, and she pretty much stays along for the ride. And then it pretty much spends the season urging the Doctor to get her back to Heathrow in 1981, when the events of Logopolis occurred. But then obviously the Doctor would mess up thanks to the TARDIS messing up or some other element, so that was messing up, and obviously she's gonna go quite upset about it. But I do like how she was able to steal the ambulance in part 1 and with Nessa try and get back to the TARDIS along with the Doctor, and I thought that was quite cool and another establishing moment for Teagan. I also did like the bit where her and Nessa were in the Tardis Console room, and obviously after avoiding the events of event 1, they were trying to find the index file, which they did by talking about the word F. And you also liked how Teagan was telling Nessa how her father, her uncle, said that F was the most powerful word in human language, and they were able to find the index file with the initials IF, which stood for index file. I also liked how Teagan was trying to pilot the TARDIS, but she ended up landing the TARDIS awkwardly in Castrovalva, and it landed quite, how could I use, the TARDIS usually lands like this, obviously, but then when the TARDIS landed in Castrovalva, it was like this, and Teagan was quite satisfied with how she was able to land the TARDIS, but then I did like how she was quite disappointed when she found out that it was pretty much the Master and Adric's doing why the TARDIS ended up in Castrovalva. And the side cast, and to be honest, there weren't that many, and there weren't that were wholly noticeable, but they were all, except for the policeman on Earth, they were created by the Master with his block computation transfer, and but I mentioned the two that were quite good and actually contributed to the plot. First of all, we had Shardvan. He was the librarian. He was the one that pretty much cornered the Doctor when he arrived at Castrovalva, and he also tried to help the Doctor in some aspects, but he was destroyed when he was killed when he tried to destroy the Master's Hadron Web, which he ended up succeeding in doing, but it came at the cost of his life. And you also had Murgrave, a doctor of Castrovalva, and he aided the Fifth Doctor in stopping the Master, but he ended up sacrificing his life to ensure that the Master ended up getting trapped in Castrovalva. I really liked Murgrave. He was a very interesting character. Then we also have the Patriot. He was basically like an elderly figure of Castrovalva, but he ended up being the Master, and I'll explain that a little bit later. And the villain of the story is, of course, the Master. After his plan to destroy the universe with his entropy wave had failed, but he was successful in killing the Fourth Doctor and causing him to regenerate, he escaped in his TARDIS, but he decided to arrive to kill the police officers to kidnap Adric and sending a projection of Adric into the TARDIS, so he can do his own dirty work in the TARDIS, ensuring that the TARDIS gets destroyed and ends up in Castrovalva. And the Master actually got Adric to create Castrovalva in order to kill the Doctor once for all, and to ensure that his plan succeeded, he disguised himself as the Portreeve in order to convince the Doctor that Castrovalva was real, and he was quite convincing. He was pretty much being nice to the Doctor, Nessa, and Teagan, and obviously he had this like disguise. You can actually see his face a little bit, but at the end, he ends up getting trapped in Castrovalva when it was starting to collapse in on itself, and it started properly collapsing on itself, and he ended up getting trapped. But obviously, this is the Master talking about. He'll obviously find a way to escape, and the people that he created on Castrovalva were pretty much responsible for trapping him there. And I think Anthony Ainley did a good job portraying the Master and Portreeve, and the Portreeve was actually credited as his own was credited on his own with an actor called Neil Toyney. And obviously that was an anagram of Anthony Ainley, and it was quite obvious that Ainley was the Portreeve, because even with the thick beard he has, you can still like make it out that it was actually Ainley, because you can see like his face and his eyes is quite distinct. So the thoughts in the story, even though they are there, but I think I can overlook them, but it's not as many. Like, I did notice that Adric was missing for a good chunk of the story, but he was obviously used by the Master to keep Castrovalva running. But I think this becomes an occurring issue in the 19th season, because you have 3 companions in the TARDIS, and you probably have one companion just tossed aside because the plot is unable to carry all 3 companions, and obviously this pretty much strengthens the argument that having a 3-person TARDIS team doesn't work all the time. So I think Adric in this story is pretty much the companion that suffers from not doing much in the plot. Well, so also, speaking of which, I said before, Adric, Nessa, and Teagan just pretty much unfazed by the Doctor's regeneration, but as I said before, they all went through their own personal hells in the last 2-3 stories. It didn't really bother them one bit, but I do think Adric might have explained it to them what the Doctor was doing in between seeing the Doctor regenerate and trying to get him back to the TARDIS. But I think but I do like to believe that the Doctor and Romana did tell Adric what the Time Lords were capable of, like regeneration, because compared to Nessa and Teagan, he was with the Doctor the longest, and he was travelling with 2 Time Lords whilst he stood away in the TARDIS in E-space. But I think those thoughts can be overlooked, because I actually do really enjoy Castrovalva, and I just love it so much. I just think the characterization, the moments, the story itself, it had an impact on me, so to speak. So To conclude, Castrovalva is a story that pretty much perfectly introduces Peter Davison, the Doctor, and brings a satisfying conclusion to the Master Trilogy, and this story properly kicks off the John Nathan Turner era better than the Leisure Hive did. So I give Castrovalva a perfect 10 out of 10. Yay! So my next review will be 4 to Doomsday, this first story in which Peter Davison films as the Fifth Doctor. Thank you for watching this review. Please let me know your thoughts on Castrovalva. Subscribe to my channel if you've come across, if you haven't done so already, because I've actually rebranded, so please feel free to subscribe. Follow me on my social media pages, and I shall be seeing you very later. Ta-ra.